Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Local Investing in Montana webinar. My name is Andrew Connor, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more about myself and give you a little bit of an introduction before we welcome Michael Shuman, who is the guest of the hour today. And before we get started, I just want to ask everyone to take a quick second and jump in the chat. And if you don't mind sticking your name, your location, and whatever affiliations you have that sort of bring you today. Go ahead and just stick those in the chat while we're getting started here, just so we can have a sense of who all's here and everyone can get a feel for other folks who are on the call. And throughout the course of what we're doing here today, feel free to put any questions or comments you have in the chat as well. We will be monitoring those, and there'll be a little bit of time to pick those up along the way. So, quick introduction of myself. I am Andrew Connor, and I am the director of the Center for Community Ownership based here in Missoula. And just a super brief overview of the work we do. We help communities fill holes in their local economies using community-owned business models. So if they need a grocery store or a childcare facility or something that's not being served by traditional entrepreneurs, traditional investors, or change stores, we help communities organize their local capital and their energy and their effort, and we bring the technical expertise to the table for them to create a community-owned business to fill that hole. Similarly, we also help transitioning business owners exit to community if that is something that they are interested in doing. So for the Center for Community Ownership, we're very interested in community investment in a broader sense, not just full community ownership, but also community investment at large. So to that goal, we have also partnered with Crowdfund Main Street to create Crowdfund Montana, which is a new investment crowdfunding platform that is serving businesses and organizations here in Montana. So you can check that out. We've got one offering that is posted there currently, the Pacific Northwest Rural Broadband Alliance, which is something that anybody can invest in now. And Michael will tell you a little bit more about investment crowdfunding later, but just want to draw your attention to that. And this webinar that we are doing is also, it's a part of a sort of a process that we're playing out over the next few months, which in addition to doing this overview webinar today, Michael is going to be doing a series of more in-depth dives into these local investing tools and strategies in early 2022. And that is TBD, the dates and stuff and the details, but I will certainly reach out to everyone who's on this call and let you know about that. And then we're also going to be starting a local investing group here in Montana. So people who are interested in putting all these local investing tools and strategies to use, both for individual wealth building, but also community wealth building and economic development as well. So keep an eye out for those things coming down the pike in the next few months. And then we'll also have some new exciting offerings coming up on Crowdfund Montana as well. So that's stuff that's happening soon. And I just want to give one sort of like little slice of information before I hand things off to Michael here about really the potential and the power that we have for local investing. And Michael will get into this into a more thorough way in his presentation. But, a couple of years ago when I was starting the Center for Community Ownership, I asked Michael, who has been a great inspiration and source of information for me over the years, sort of how to think about what sort of funds were available for investment or community investment. And he pointed me towards a tool that the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, which is the federal agency that insures your deposits in banks, they have a tool where you can look up by zip code how much money is available in deposits, checking accounts, savings accounts, certificates of deposits or CDs, or money market accounts in banks in certain zip codes. And that is a pretty crude measure of money that might be investable, but it's a pretty good way to get a rough estimate of how much money is available in the community that can be redirected towards these really powerful ways of transforming local economies. And I'm just going to run you through a few of these just to give a sense of things. I want to do a quick quiz for you. Many of you may or may not know the town of Malta up on the High Line in Northeast Montana. It's a town of about 2,000 folks. And I love people to put some guesses in the chat about how much money they think is deposited in bank branches in Malta. Just throw some guesses in the chat, whatever you think might be possible. I'll give it 20 seconds and then I'll give you the answers. Some of these folks have been on previous calls, so they know my shtick a little bit. So yeah, some of you are coming pretty close around here. So Malta, 205 million. And that's a town of about 2,000 people in Northeast Montana. And if we sort of take a quick tour around the state, we find some really interesting stuff. Whitefish, a little over $500 million. Kalispell, more than $2 billion. Missoula, more than $2.5 billion. Butte, almost 700 million. Helena, 2 billion. Great Falls, almost 2 billion. Bozeman, almost 4. Billings, over 5.5 billion. So those are all the big cities, right? And, even some of these smaller communities like Hamilton, over $500 million. Dillon, more than 300 million. Shelby, again, up in the, in the far reaches, 134 million. Glendive, almost 300 million. So this is just to give you a sense of the scale of what is available, the power that we have. My interest in this community investing and community ownership work is really that we don't have to rely on, super wealthy individuals or foundations with tons of money or government agencies. We have all of this power in our hands and a lot of available capital to really make transformative things happen. So I just want to put that in your minds to just really reflect on how much potency and how much power there is here for us to affect change with local investing. And with that, I will turn it over to Michael and just give a brief introduction. Michael is an extremely accomplished author, economist, attorney, speaker. He has been a real thought leader in the local economy and local investing space for decades. I've had the fortune of knowing him for the last 10 years, and he's just been, like I said, a great inspiration and a source of support and information for me. And I'm really grateful that he is willing to share this information with us today. So with no further ado, Michael, I'll hand it off to you. Oh, and you're still muted, looks like, Michael.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Very kind introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming for hopefully an enriching hour or so of your time. And I'm going to throw a lot of information at you. And in a way, this, as Andrew said, this is kind of a bit of a taste of a deeper dive kind of set of workshops that I've done in other states. And I'm hoping with Andrew, with many of you, to do that deeper dive workshop in Montana. I should also say that I've had the pleasure of doing a fair amount of work in Montana over the last 5-6 years, mostly with Native American reservations. I've done a lot of work with Fort Belknap, Crow, Northern Cheyenne, Flathead Reservation, and I love your state and would love to help make the state stronger. So that's really what this presentation is all about. And I'm really thrilled that you have a ton of very important resources in the state, including Andrew's Center for Community Ownership. So I would say if you are interested in creating a grocery store, creating a specific local business model, you might think about collaborating with the Center for Community Ownership on that kind of project. The starting place, I think, for thinking about local investment is really understanding where our economy is right now. I mean, we've just gone through this horrible pandemic, still going through it, really, but it has affected a lot of damage on our communities, on people in our communities, and most significantly for purposes of today's conversation on local businesses. Local businesses are an essential source of community strength, and we need to figure out new ways urgently of supporting local businesses if we want our communities to continue to prosper. Why do local businesses matter? Well, this was a study done in Seattle in 2017, comparing the way money moves through a co-op grocery store called Central Co-op and a chain grocery store. And what you can see is that for every dollar that goes through the Central Co-op, about 50 cents stays in the local economy. Whereas for the chain grocery store, it's about 25 cents. So the difference is so profound that if you were to replace the Central Co-op with a similarly sized chain grocer, Seattle would lose about 150 jobs. We know from a bunch of studies that have been done over the last 20 years, comparing similar jurisdictions or similar industries or similar businesses, one locally owned, one not, that the locally owned business or industry generates 2 to 4 times the income, wealth, and job effects that a non-locally owned business or industry generates. And there is not a single study that has shown otherwise. But don't take my word for it. This is from the Harvard Business Review in the summer of 2010. It's a regression analysis of communities across the United States. The title says more small firms means more jobs. And what the study showed is that in communities with a higher density of locally owned business, there is a higher per capita job growth rate. But not just that, but this study from the Federal Reserve of Atlanta in 2013, which looked at counties across the United States, found that in those counties with the highest density of locally owned business, there is the highest per capita income growth rate. So in other words, if you want to reduce poverty, if you want to raise incomes and social equity levels in your community, locally owned businesses are your best ticket for doing so. And we also know that locally owned businesses are critical for other objectives of economic development, smart growth, because local businesses really enable you to achieve neighborhood density where businesses and residences can cohabit together. Local businesses create the unique DNA that attracts tourists. Local businesses are where entrepreneurship largely takes place. We now have a public health literature that shows that because some of the first local businesses that receive attention in a localist movement are food businesses, that local business communities, because of their local food movements, have lower rates of type 2 diabetes and lower rates of obesity. And we also know from political science work that local business communities, because people are more deeply rooted there, have higher rates of voting participation and volunteership. Local businesses are also pretty important for environmental protection. Local businesses generate the wealth that could be used for environmental protection. Local distribution of goods, say farm to table kinds of food distribution, carries a lower carbon footprint than imported food. And we also know from funny studies like the EPA has done looking at smokestack industries, that smokestack industries that are locally owned actually are cleaner than their absentee-owned counterparts. And the only explanation really is shame. That is that if you live in a community with a smokestack industry where the owner lives there, you can give them a piece of your mind if you bump into them in the grocery store, church, or wherever. That is not possible with absentee ownership. So out of those observations about what works in economy building, I, for many years, have promoted a package around local economic development that sort of emphasizes 6 Ps: planning, people, partners, purse, purchasing, and policymaking. Planning means doing leakage analysis, identifying all the places where people in your community are unnecessarily buying outside goods and services. People means supporting entrepreneurs to lead new or expanded businesses that plug those leaks. Partners means creating networks of local business that are more competitive as a team than they would be on their own. Purse means tapping local savings, whether short-term savings in banks or long-term savings in pension funds, and putting them to work in local business development. Purchasing is about buy local or think local first campaigns, and then policy making is really a whole range of things that local government or perhaps your tribal government would do. And on these, it's really just important to have a level playing field so that local business can compete fairly. Now, when I go around the country and sometimes outside the country to talk about this, local businesses usually tell me they have one overarching concern, and that is purse. They desperately need capital. This is true during normal times, but during COVID times, this is even a more profound need. So I want to talk a little bit about the structure of finance in our economy. So this graph here is from data from 2018. It's changed a little bit since then, but it's a good base to work from. And if you ask the question, well, how big are the assets that households and nonprofits have, financial assets? And let's, nonprofits are not a big part of this picture, so we really could just say household assets. It's well over $100 trillion. So those of you who pay attention to economic data know that our gross domestic product is around $20 trillion. So this is more than 5 times greater. And the big block, the black block at the top, that's tangible assets like housing. At the bottom is banks, which is a little over $10 trillion. But then there's a big mass on top of that, which is securities. And I think it's interesting that Andrew presented all these data based on banking data, but that's just a small piece of the puzzle. That in fact, when you add in securities, you could take Andrew's numbers and multiply them by about 5-fold to give you a sense of the amount of capital that's available in your community. So there is, if we take apart this securities block, it really is made up of components of stocks, bonds, insurance funds, pension funds, and mutual funds. It's a total of $56 trillion in 2018. Now, if we had more time together, I would show you data that would make clear to you that depending on how you define locally owned businesses and institutions are responsible for 60 to 80% of the jobs in the economy. These businesses are highly profitable, highly competitive, and they are certainly worthy of our investment. But if we were in a room together, I would take you through a series of responsive questions. And one of the questions I would ask is, by show of hands, how many of you with pension funds put at least 1% of that 401k or IRA into locally owned business? And what has happened when I've done this, and I've done this hundreds of times, is there's one or two hands that go up in the audience, and usually they are wrong. What this highlights is the incredible market failure that we have right now. That even though local businesses are critical for our well-being, they are responsible for 60 to 80% of our jobs, they are not getting 60 to 80% of our capital. They're getting almost none of it, which means all of us are systematically over-investing in Fortune 500 companies that are disconnected from well-being in our community, and underinvesting in local businesses that are essential for local prosperity. The reason for this goes back to securities laws that were enacted during the Great Depression. And we created this distinction between the accredited investor like Gordon Gekko here, the richest 5% or so of American households, and unaccredited investors, everyone else, most of the people on this call, me, in fact. And the way that we set up securities laws is we basically said, if you're an accredited investor, you're allowed to invest in anything, anytime, no questions asked, pretty much. Whereas if you're an unaccredited investor, you cannot put a penny into a local business until that business has done a mountain of legal work. And historically, that legal work could easily cost $10, $15, $25, $50,000. And that was the reason why you saw very little grassroots investment in local businesses. If we could fix this capital market failure, if we could get 60% of that $56 trillion into the 60% of businesses that are locally owned, you could take your community, take the population, and multiply each person by $100,000, and that's the amount of additional capital available. There is no conceivable economic development policy on the table that could possibly accomplish even a small fraction of what getting our investment right could do. Now, you don't need perfection to actually accomplish a lot in this field. This is a study that I did with two other people in Metro Cleveland in 2010. It's called the 25% shift. And we were looking at what would be the impacts if Metro Cleveland, a multi-county region, I think it was like 14 or 15 counties, what if this region shifted its expenditures 25% in the direction of local food? And we calculated that this shift would create 27,000 new jobs, paying almost $900 million and generating $126 million in new state and local taxes. Now, in order to achieve this, you would need to expand local food businesses. And we estimated that that expansion would require about $750 million. That sounds like a lot of money, but $750 million is this tiny red stripe on the left. It's 1% of what people in Metro Cleveland have in their bank accounts, and 1/4% of what they have in their pension funds. So even a tiny movement of capital, if we all move 1/4 or 1% of our long-term savings into local business, this can really make a huge difference in local economic development. Now, the good news is that the law has changed. This is a picture that I took from the Rose Garden. It was the only time I was in the Rose Garden at the signing ceremony for the Jobs Act in 2012 that basically legalized investment crowdfunding. And this made crowdfunding, this made local investment suddenly accessible to the masses, because under the terms of the bill, any person can invest up to $2,200 per year in local business. Any business initially could raise as much as $1 million, and all they had to do was go through a fairly routine protocol and listing themselves on a federally licensed website, of which there are now about 80. And here's a kind of photo from Invest in Main Street. It's from Mainvest, but it's one of many of the investment portals out there. That $1 million ceiling actually has been raised to $5 million. So it took a couple of years from 2012, the signing of the Jobs Act, for the regulations to appear. But starting in 2016, we were off to the races with grassroots investment. And the record has really been quite extraordinary. Since 2016, basically we have more than 1 million people in the United States investing more than $1 billion in 4,000 primarily local companies. The average investment has been about $800. The average raise, a successful raise by companies doing investment crowdfunding, has been close to $300,000. And the most successful entrepreneurs, and this is very important, the most successful entrepreneurs have been women and people of color. That is, those people whom the markets had traditionally been biased against, and they're the ones who in this more fair, more democratic marketplace are doing very well. Now, I do want to clarify that there's a lot of different types of crowdfunding out there. There's donation crowdfunding on sites like Kickstarter. There's interest-free lending on sites like Kiva. There's peer-to-peer lending that you can do on sites like Prosper or the Lending Club. But what we're talking about here is investment. Investment under what's called Title III of the Jobs Act. And all kinds of investment are permitted under the Jobs Act. Debt, equity, you can create convertible notes, you can create royalty agreements, which are payments on a percentage, say, of profits or gross revenues. You sometimes can find interesting arrangements like safe notes, which gives you basically access to future equity if you want to purchase more stock at some future point. So there's a lot of creative kinds of securities that are being issued out there. Now, at this point, I want to pause for a second and, in a way, zoom out and look at the big picture, because local investment is not just about investment in businesses. That clearly is an important feature of it, but local investment could be in yourself, for example, getting yourself out of credit card debt, or it could be investment in your kids to get them out of student loan debt, or it could be investment in their kids to help get them a house. It could be an investment in a nonprofit to lend money to your favorite nonprofit or church to help them buy real estate and bring down their annual expenses. It can be investment in a community fund, and there are some local investment funds like the Evergreen Fund in Montana. It can be investment in municipal bonds that are focused on very particular local activities. The state of Connecticut, for example, recently issued $25 million of bonds in small denominations so grassroots people could buy them to support the expanding solar industry in Connecticut. And by the way, they were sold out within 48 hours. And so they're back with more bonds now. It could be keeping your money in a local bank, or it could be putting money into local real estate. And real estate is, I would say, one of the expanding areas of local crowdfunding. And since Andrew and several of you are really involved in real estate transactions as well as business, I thought I would say a few additional things about real estate, because to many investors, real estate is seen as kind of advantageous because it's not just the vaporware of a promise from a business, but it's real land. Generally, these deals have lower risk, and oftentimes there are partnership opportunities that enable you to diversify the risk with a pool of real estate properties. This picture here is of a banker that I've been working with in central North Carolina. He has a bank called Uwari, and I helped to connect him to a crowdfunding site based in the South called Vicinity Capital. And he raised in grassroots investment about $1 million extra to support his bank's investment in a major real estate project in their hometown. And you are starting to see a lot of creative mixing and matching of various sorts of sources of capital with crowdfunding these days. But one of the things that I'm excited to see is the use of crowdfunding to support different ways of promoting affordable housing. So one way of doing this is perhaps to expand the coffers of funds that are in the hands of community land trusts. Community land trusts, by the way, are basically where the trust owns the land. They put out 100-year leases on the houses. And since you as a homeowner don't own the land, you're just owning the house, it's cheaper, so it's more affordable. And you also can put in arrangements to keep that, basically that ownership stake and that price of the real estate affordable in perpetuity. The biggest land trust in the United States, by the way, was started with a municipal bond by a mayor in Burlington, Vermont, named Bernie Sanders back in the 1980s. $200,000 municipal bond has led to the growth of a house, home land trust in Burlington that now involves nearly 3,000 families and is worth more than $100 million. Another thing that we're seeing are the development of neighborhood REITs, real estate investment trusts. So this is a REIT that was created in a Portland, Oregon shopping center, and basically invited people who live near the shopping center to buy pieces of the shopping center. And in doing so, they stabilized the plight of about 300 small businesses in this shopping center. It's called a community investment trust, and it's being spread all around the country now. And now we're seeing some other creative things where people can invest in down payments. So there's a company that facilitates your ability to invest in down payments of essential workers like healthcare workers as a way of supporting them during the pandemic. And then we have companies like Nico that are enabling people in Los Angeles to help other residents of Los Angeles buy into affordable real estate in apartment complexes. So lots of creative stuff going on in the housing world. The goal of local investing is really to accomplish three things. You want to get people a reasonable rate of return. You want to generate a high social return by supporting, say, local businesses, and you want the risk to be manageable. Let me talk briefly about the issue of return. So if you listen to people like Rick Edelman on AM radio, you're going to believe that leave your money in Wall Street long term, you'll get 10% rate of return, 12%, 15%, 20%. These numbers are all interesting and all made up. The place you really should look is the website of Robert Shiller, professor at Yale, Nobel economist. He wrote a book called Irrational Exuberance. On his website, you can find data on stock values going back to the beginnings of the S&P. And if you duly add dividends, take out inflation, you find that as of today, the stock market has an annual growth rate of about 8%. Now, that 8% has to be understood with a bunch of footnotes. Footnote number one, we are at the peak, the historic peak of the stock market right now. And things go up, things go down. If I was measuring from, say, mid-2000s, this 8% would be 5%. Second thing, all these transactions carry a cost. Your mutual fund, for example, is probably charging you about 1% a year. So that's going to bring down your return. And then in your IRA or 401k, at the end of having this money in there, you're taxed again as income. So I think that a more reasonable number to assign to the stock market and a more reasonable goal that you want local investment to achieve is closer to 5% per year. Now, you may have a different judgment, but if you use 5% per year, what you find is there are some forms of local investment that are definitely better than Wall Street. Certainly, comparing the 20% a year you're paying on your credit card to the 5% per year that you might get on Wall Street, no brainer to put your money into getting out of credit card debt. And the same with student debt. Really, most calculations on house value, even without appreciation because of tax issues, that's going to pay better. Energy efficiency, real estate investments are doing better than 5% now. Co-ops are often borrowing money from their members at more than 5%. And then, on the right-hand side are things that are paying probably a bit less than 5%. A lot of the crowdfunding offerings from businesses, nonprofits, community funds, municipal bonds are relatively low now. Banks are paying almost nothing. So yeah, so you have a range of returns out there. But the point is that an astute local investor can probably do as well or better than Wall Street. And one reason I am optimistic in the long term about local investment and the returns is that we actually have some good data that local business has higher profit rates than Wall Street. So the best data I've been able to find on this are from Canada from 2009. And what you can see in this chart here is that the most profitable companies are 10 to 20 employees. which are about 99% locally owned. The least profitable companies are those with over 500 employees, which is the only place where you're going to find publicly traded companies. And these are the companies that are traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. In terms of risk, if I was to ask a registered investment advisor for their advice and say, well, my bookstore is thinking of setting up another bookstore in another place. It's very successful. Should I invest in this local bookstore? And chances are very good that your registered investment advisor will say to you, don't invest in that. All local businesses fail. They have a very high failure rate. And immediately your registered investment advisor made a very common mistake, even among experts, because you're not talking about a startup. These failure rates are associated with startup local businesses. 95% of all local businesses are not startups in any given year. And their success rate, if they've been around for a while, they have a very low risk. It doesn't mean there's no risk, but it just is the kind of conversation and a kind of teaching you have to do with your registered investment advisor. But that said, there are risks associated with your local investment. You know, the risk that you have to look over the business itself, but there's also the risk that you'll have fewer businesses to choose from locally, so the chance of choosing wrong is higher. There's also the issue that business cycles in the community go up and down, and if you have a portfolio with geographically defined local businesses, if your business cycle is in a downswing, all of those securities may go down. So those are very real risks of local business. But there are very real ways that local businesses bring down risk. So just to give you a couple of examples, we know, for example, that people have better information about their local businesses than publicly traded companies. So you can make a more informed investment decision. And the reason is that you actually can knock on the door of the local business you're going to invest in. You can ground truth the good or the service. You can talk with the management, talk with the employees, and get a feel for, just how well is this business doing. And we know from banking, by the way, that relationship-based banking has lower default rates than computerized score-based banking. We also know that the local business is going to generate, in addition to your private rate of return, a social rate of return. That is, the money goes into your economy, it boosts employment, it lowers taxation, it expands the police and the schools, and all of that is part of your rate of return. That does not happen with a Wall Street investment. And finally, we know that when investors are also customers, which was what tends to happen locally, well, you become a lot more loyal. So if you are a member of a co-op and investing in that co-op, well, you're going to be encouraging your friends and neighbors to invest in that co-op, and because you're going to get a rate of return from that as well. How do you find local investments? Well, one way of finding them is simply to look for fellow travelers. So for example, who are the small business development centers in your communities? Where are the entrepreneurship courses? Where are the incubators, the maker spaces? The people who run these institutions, they actually have a good sense of where are some local business opportunities you might invest in. Another thing that you might do is create a group. So in Port Townsend, Washington, in 2007, the guy on the right, James Fraser, set up something called Lion, Local Investment Opportunity Network. And Lion is basically a potluck where local investors and local businesses get together once a month and they develop relationships with one another. And those relationships facilitate later on investment. Lion is responsible for facilitating $800,000 of new local investment per year, every year since 2007. And remember, Lion is a 10,000 person community. So if your community is larger and you do a bunch of Lions, you can do the math on that. But that is a great way of finding local investment, to bring a group of people together and exchange information. One of the things that I've done with a colleague named Stephanie Geller is create in Baltimore a website called the Maryland Neighborhood Exchange, which just lists all the businesses in Baltimore that are on the federal crowdfunding portals. So that if you're a Baltimore resident and are interested in doing local investment, you can just go to the Maryland Neighborhood Exchange and say, aha, here are my investment opportunities this week. So we estimate that over a 1.5 year period, the Maryland Neighborhood Exchange has facilitated about 6,000 investors putting $3.5 million into 44 small businesses, most of them run by BIPOC entrepreneurs. And this, by the way, is, I think, the function of what Andrew's Crowdfund Montana is going to be doing as well. So you are now among the very few number of states that have a tool like this at your disposal to facilitate local investing. Another way you can find local investments is through a website called investibule.co. And this is kind of just a generic information site. You can put in your state, or you can put in the type of business you're interested in, and voila, a list of live crowdfunding offers will come out and will help you. So once you find local investments, you do have to evaluate them. You have to evaluate the risks and returns. You have to evaluate the liquidity. So liquidity is, how quickly can you convert the investment into cash? So say if you're giving a 1-year loan, well, that's pretty liquid. If it's a 10-year loan, not so liquid. If it's a piece of stock with no particular date that you can sell it by, well, that's not very liquid at all. It also depends on your own risk profile. And one of the things that I work with people in the course to do is to do a deep dive of their own wealth profile and risk profile, and really figure out, where are all their assets now? How many are high risk, how many are low risk, how many are high and low liquidity. And then as they're looking at local investments, to figure out how you would put those into this grid. Another challenge that we address in the course, and another challenge that local investors face, is that most of our savings, if we have some, are going to be locked away in pension funds that have no local investment options. So the typical 401k, no local investment possibility. The typical IRA that's, say, in TD Ameritrade, no local investment opportunities. But there are specific ways you can create local investment opportunities for yourself by creating for yourself either a self-directed IRA or a solo 401k. So with a self-directed IRA, there's about 200 companies out there that you can hire a custodian. And if you shop around, you can find a custodian for as cheap as about $250 per year. That would be Rocket Dollar. And you basically tell that custodian where you want your money to go to, and they have to follow your instructions as long as it's legal. Still better is the solo 401k, which is primarily for self-employed individuals. And with a solo 401k, you don't need to hire a custodian. You just need to create a new bank account for the trust you're administering. And you need to rent some legal papers from about 50 companies out there that will provide it to you. And again, so this will cost you about $300 over a 6-year period. And again, Rocket Dollar has a pretty good product that they could give to you. When you compare the two, the solo 401k is far more advantageous. But a lot of you are thinking, well, I'm not self-employed or I have a day job. And the truth is that all you need to create a solo 401k is $1 of Schedule C income. It doesn't have to be your day job. You can have a day job and $1 of income that you report on Schedule C, and then you can create the solo 401k. And the solo 401k is better than the self-directed IRA because it's cheaper to set up. You can run it out of your own checkbook. You're allowed to contribute a significantly higher amount every year. So if you're a self-employed person and have some feast years and famine years, boy, solo 401k is a way to save yourself a lot of tax misery. And another thing that you can do with a solo 401k is that you can give yourself a loan at a very low interest rate and pay yourself back over a 5-year period. So say if you have a credit card debt of say $25,000, you've had a rough run with credit card companies, you could borrow $25,000 from your solo 401k, pay off your credit cards, and then pay yourself back at a couple of percentage points rather than the credit card company at 20% interest rates. The magic formula, I think, is set up a solo 401k as soon as humanly possible. And then, when you're done with your day job, you either retire, resign, you're fired, whatever happens, at that moment, you can retake control of that retirement account and you could roll that over into your solo 401k and you're off to the races being as much of a local investor as you want to be. If you're interested, by the way, in just this narrow topic of self-directed IRAs and solo 401ks, there's another organization I helped set up a couple of years ago called the Next Egg. It has several hundred members on it who are sort of puzzling together over all of the interesting regulations and challenges of doing this. But it's a good group of people that can help you administer things satisfactorily. Another topic that I cover in the course is to really help businesses think about maybe they should be raising local capital. Maybe they're tired of trying to knock at the doors of hedge funds, venture funds, or investment banks because they've heard no too many times. And, there's a lot of questions that you as a business need to ask about whether or not, say, you want to do crowdfunding as a way of getting capital. So, you may be afraid of taking on more debt. You may be afraid of taking on more owners. It is going to be an administrative headache if you have more people investing in your company. And if you're crowdfunding, we do know that existing businesses with a good track record are going to be more successful than startups with no track record. So among the questions that I think a business wants to look at is, do you have actual sales? Do you have a solid growth plan? Do you have a good board of directors? And then another question about crowdfunding is, do you have a really kick-ass mailing list? Because a lot of people just assume, oh, I'll put my company on a crowdfunding site and just watch the money come in. No, it doesn't work that way. You have got to get your fans to go to that website and invest in it. So if you're going to raise, $50,000 through investment crowdfunding, you better have a mailing list of at least, say, 1,000 names. And if you're going to do 500,000, even more names. But these are the kinds of questions that it's really useful to walk businesses through so they can figure out whether these grassroots finance mechanisms are right for them. So next steps. If you are interested in doing a deep dive on these issues in a workshop, Andrew and I will reach out to you, and we would love to have you in this course that we do. I'll just mention, I've done this course now for Washington State, for Rhode Island, for New Hampshire. I just finished doing it for Alaska. It lasts anything from 4 to 8 weeks. We meet either once every week or once every 2 weeks for 90 minutes. And then in between, people watch 15 videotapes that I've made on these various topics for investors, for businesses, and for organizers. And, with that, great things have happened in the communities that have participated. So I'm going to stop now. It's just after the hour, and I'm around for half an hour more. So I welcome questions, and I don't know how you want to do the questions, Andrew, whether you want to have people type them in or just speak, but however you want, I'm game.
Yeah, so I'll say, I think in general, if you want to put them in the chat, go for it. I think we are a small enough group that if people want to just pop off mute and ask questions, that's fine too. So I think either that people are comfortable with. And I'll start you off, Michael. Lori had a question from a little while back. Just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on how investing in local real estate, how that would benefit the community kind of in a more general sense. I think that was the question, Lori. If I misrepresented it all, feel free to chime in. So.
Yeah, so I mean, generally, local ownership means local control. So the way that I think about it is that local control of housing means you can keep it more affordable in principle. Local control of real estate means your businesses are less likely to be squeezed out onto the street and suddenly go out of business. It's not a perfect measure of stability, and there are local landlords that are not very nice and not very easy to deal with. But I do think that, those of us who've been in the field of promoting local ownership understand that at some basic level, with local ownership, with local control, you have a better shot at creating the kind of community well-being you want.
Michael, would you agree also that there's maybe a significant, maybe sort of inverse opportunity cost? Money invested locally is, even if it's in real estate, is money that's not being invested potentially in the stock market or somewhere else where that money is leaving the community. So it's one way of keeping it local.
Oh, absolutely. That's right. And yeah, so every dollar invested in your community is going to multiply into community wealth in a bunch of different ways. whereas every dollar that's invested outside your community is just a loss. I mean, you'll get a private return from that, but that's why it's important to understand that local investment is you're looking for a private return that's kind of close to what you would get from Wall Street, plus a social return.
Great. We got two questions from Dr. Jennifer Isser. So hopefully I'm pronouncing that last name correctly. Apologies if I'm not. What is the track record on local loans to small businesses in terms of being repaid? I'll just start there. There's a series of questions here. We'll start with that one. Track record on loans to local businesses being repaid.
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the institution. So, I mean, there's a lot of micro enterprise entities, starting with Grameen Bank and then spreading through the United States that brag 97, 98% repayment rates. I don't know what the prevailing rates are with banks and what the relative default rates look like. With the crowdfunding issues, those are going to be interesting data to look at because crowdfunding was legalized effectively in 2016, and most of the crowdfunded loans really have materialized in the last year or two. We don't quite have data yet on that, but it will be interesting to look at that and to see, where defaults come. Is it a function of size? Is it a function of the maturity of the business? Is it a function of the sector? We just don't know yet.
Great. And then
actually,
yeah, go ahead,
sorry,
Jennifer.
Andrew, if I could just jump in, just on that point, Michael. So I've been following some of the peer-to-peer lending in the US and globally. There's some, I think, very reasonable repayment rates overall, but we're also seeing some of the growth in that. The biggest example is in China, where it's just been taking off the last 5 years, and quite a few problems in terms of peer-to-peer lending or peer-to-peer equity, in terms of repayment rates, but also in terms of getting equity exits. And I'm just wondering, I hear what you're saying. This is relatively a newly enabled phenomenon in terms of financial engineering since the Jobs Act. So we may not have that much of a track record. And that's, I guess, what I'm asking is, what is the performance track record on lending or equity through these types of mechanisms?
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting question. I would turn the question around though, and I would ask the question, if I wanted to engage in lending through various local investment tools, what would be the ways that I could mitigate the risk and make the risk reasonable for my own sense of risk tolerance? Because what you see over the whole universe may or may not be what you go into. So if you are highly risk averse, I think you want to only invest in companies that have been around 5 or 10 years. B, you want to invest in a company that you know really well. You love, the people in it, you have pretty good confidence in the data and information they release. C, you want a business that you not only love, but you understand. So if it's, a friend selling you on crypto, and personally, I've never understood a conversation about cryptocurrencies, I wouldn't put money into that. So I think, we have to, every investment that you do at any scale is going to carry risk. And all I'm saying is, I think what we want to do is how different markets perform on average is going to be less relevant than how we calibrate our own behavior to minimize the risks or make those risks commensurate with what we personally can tolerate. Now, I will say one final thing, which is I think that ultimately what we want is a bunch of local investment funds. Funds would be places where an investment manager, does a lot of the shopping and evaluation for us, and where there's diversification of the risk so that if one company goes south, the others are not adversely affected. I wrote a handbook with several other people a year and a half ago, which you folks can find out there. Andrew, maybe you can post it in the chat.
I'll share it. Yeah, I'll do that.
But it has 10 case studies of local investment funds, including this evergreen fund in Montana. But it's really, there's very few of these funds so far. I mean, I'd love to see them expand, but if you're really risk averse, that would be the place to go. So funds that have been around a long time that do local investing are like the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund, the Vermont Community Loan Fund, there's one in Kentucky, there's one in Columbus, Ohio. So yeah, there's a bunch that you can find, but we're still talking about like 20 overall in the country.
I want to share, Mark had a question. Is there a path for our Montana nonprofits to invest their endowment funds locally?
Yes, well, I don't know about investing in endowments. Well, maybe. Let's leave the question of endowments to the side for a second. But there are two strategies for investing in nonprofits that I think are really relevant. So one is for a nonprofit to buy its building. And basically, that you as a supporter of the nonprofit, you buy a couple of bricks of the building, either through a loan or through an investment. And as a result, like most nonprofits that I've worked for historically, something like 25% of their budget is on rent. So if you can relieve your nonprofit of that rent expenditure, you're doing some good stuff for the program intention of your nonprofit. Another thing you can do, so in this local investment fund handbook, there is a fund called the Northeast Kingdom Fund in Vermont. And basically it's a nonprofit charitable trust. So the way, for those of you who don't know how this operates, if you're someone who wants to give away some money, you can put it in the form of a charitable trust, and you say would get an income from that money over your lifetime. And then when you die, that equity goes to the nonprofit. But the moment you put it into the charitable trust, you're able to take a significant tax write-off. So that's the structure that this Northeast Kingdom Fund has used to draw in several $1 million to then support its charitable aims. So I think that's an interesting frame. There's another fund that's getting off the ground in Asheville, North Carolina, called the Repair Fund, that is taking on a similar structure. So yeah, so what I don't know is that there are some like special rules around, like, what happens when you put the money into an endowment as opposed to operation and so forth. And so that's why I wanted to separate that piece out.
I guess I'd ask, Mark, you feel free to come off mute if you want. Is it, are you imagining a situation where an endowment has its funds currently invested in sort of more traditional channels, like in Wall Street, for example?
Yeah, so I'm thinking, for instance, there is a Montana Community Foundation, I think, that you can donate to and for support of a particular nonprofit. And then I think you disavow it 5 years, and you return from that, and then it goes, but it is managed by the community foundation, and I think probably largely, if not exclusively, invested in Wall Street and bonds and things of that nature.
Yeah.
So how do you get, it would be very beneficial, I think, if we could find a way to channel that money locally, and I'm just wondering if there is a path.
To Michael's point. Oh, go ahead, Michael. Sorry.
Yeah. So if I was a donor with your concern or interest, I would say, here's a big check. I want it to go to your endowment, but I will only give it to your endowment if you do an equivalent amount of local reinvestment from your endowment. So that would be one thing you could do. The big picture is mission-related investing of endowment funds there's a lot of talk about it. There's not nearly as much activity as one would like to see. I mean, you can point to a couple of interesting examples. There's a community foundation in rural Wisconsin called Encourage, where they have invested 100% of their endowment in local real estate. But that's really unusual. Then there's the other more specific set of rules are what are called program-related investment. And program-related investment basically allows foundations to broadly put their investments into entities that are in furtherance of their mission, even if they are for profit. So, for example, if I was promoting housing, I could put money into a for-profit affordable housing company. And if I lost money, I could write that loss off against what my grant requirement would be every year. If I made money, it would go back into my endowment. So, program-related investment in theory is a great concept. 30 years ago, when I started looking at program-related investment, about 0.1% of foundation assets was being invested this way. And today, it's still 0.1%.
Yeah, I'll just echo, what Michael said. There's certainly organizations that Michael and I have both been connected to in the past professionally, has sort of looked to organize, foundations in general who are mission driven, but then are investing a lot of money in things that are counter to their missions. So that effort to kind of realign what they're doing with their philanthropic dollars, and having foundations, and especially community foundations, look at that. But yeah, to Michael's point, it seems like the progress has been pretty slow on that front, but certainly something that seems like tremendous opportunity if the will is there to do it.
I should say that I have a bi-weekly newsletter that comes out called the Main Street Journal, and it's just links about local investing. But it was underwritten by a small grant from the Heron Foundation in New York. Heron is the biggest user of program-related investment in the country. And so if you want to see a model of how program-related investment can and is being used by a big foundation, look at Heron.
And I just stuck a link in there to the Main Street Journal in the
Thank
chat. It's a great newsletter. Lots of really interesting, valuable stuff in there. So I definitely recommend that everyone sign up for that if they are interested. We've got a few more minutes. Does anyone have any other questions they want to stick in the chat or come off mute and share? Well, while I've got y'all here, I'm going to do something really quickly. For those who are, if you are even remotely interested in the more in-depth workshops that we've talked about, I'm just going to do a quick poll. We've been talking generally about the idea of doing these on weekdays, maybe in the same sort of noon time slot. I'm just going to launch a poll. So if you're even remotely interested, answer this poll real quick, because I'd love to find out if any days are better than any others. Again, this is not set in stone, but we're definitely looking at kind of midday weekdays. So this would be a helpful sample if you all wouldn't mind filling that out real quickly. So I'll give you some time here. It's a tight race here. Monday is definitely last, but everything else is. It's a dead heat. Michael's voting against Friday, so keep that in mind. While you're filling out that poll, Jennifer asked a question in the chat. Speak more about my organization and activities on local investing in Montana. So. Yeah, as I mentioned at the top, Center for Community Ownership, a lot of our sort of core work is around full-on community ownership, fully owned, community owned and controlled enterprises. And as a subsidiary of that, community investment is really important to us. So that was, like I said, why we started, we supported the launch of Crowdfund Montana. And that is, so right now, that's sort of like the primary opportunity for local investment that we are connected to. And that's in the investment crowdfunding site, Crowdfund Montana. That being said, as I mentioned, I am really interested in Montana becoming a national leader in local investing. This is such a kind of new arena, in a sense, a new cultural shift and things like that. And I just think Montana is extremely well poised to be a real leader. There's obviously, you all know, people care so much about the state, care so much about our places and our towns, and so community oriented that I just really think that we have a lot of possibility to do that. So that is why I am really hoping to that people will participate in these workshops and will be a part of this convening that I'm planning to do to bring people together to just take local investing activities of all kinds, small, medium, and large scale. So right now, Crowdfund Montana is kind of where it's at, but my hope is to really sort of have the tools and the strategies available for everybody who wants to invest in whatever way they can as we move forward, to really develop a more mature local investing ecosystem. So that's kind of where things are at. And hopefully, in the coming months, in the coming year, we'll have a lot of great options for how people can get involved in local investing in Montana. So, there's a question in the chat. Oh, here we go. Sorry, a couple questions here. Lori asked, yes, so that is correct. Lori asked about Crowdfunding Montana. Currently, there is one offering up there that is going to be live for a couple more months. We have several more that are in the works. So if you keep an eye on it, we have several great businesses that are going to be launching in the next few months to do additional raises. We've got a distillery, we've got an IT firm, we've got folks who are working on a local sports facility, just a whole range of stuff. Really great. And then also the question, we'll be sharing a recording of this webinar. Yes, we will be posting it and we'll send it out to the registrants so you can feel free to share it as well. Any other thoughts, questions, anything that folks have before we depart? Well, I want to thank you all. Michael, did you have anything else that you wanted to share before we close?
No, thanks again for the opportunity to chat, and I appreciate the really thoughtful questions, and look forward to hopefully doing more work with some of you in the not too distant future. So thank you.
Great. Well, thanks to you, Michael. We really appreciate your time, and thanks. Really appreciate everybody being here and spending this time. And yep, I'll be in touch soon with follow-up. So thanks to you all and have a great day.
Great.